Welcome to today's Harper Lecture, American Politics Before and After Trump, featuring Professor John Mark Hansen. Our audience today includes more than 1,000 alumni and friends of the university from 29 different countries. My name is David Cashman, Senior Director of Alumni Relations and Development. On behalf of the Alumni Association of the university, thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, I would like to note a couple of housekeeping items. There will be 3 people speaking today. You will hear me, Professor Hansen, and our moderator, Luis Miranda. All other participants will be muted. However, we would like for you to participate by asking questions. To do that, type a question in the Q&A box at any time during the talk. Our staff will be compiling questions and will share a poll with you so that you can upvote your favorite question. Doing so will help our moderator and Professor Hansen answer questions more efficiently. If you have issues with the audio, you may want to shut down programs running in the background or dial in from your telephone. Our program will last for 60 minutes today. Professor Hansen will deliver a presentation, and we expect around 20 minutes of questions from you. This webinar is being recorded, and we will make it available to you on the Harper Lecture YouTube channel. A link will be sent to you in a follow-up email. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Luis Miranda. Luis is a dedicated volunteer and supporter of the University of Chicago. He is a graduate of the Booth School of Business and also the parent of a recently graduated student of our college. Luis is chairman of the Indian School of Public Policy, which has a partnership with the University of Chicago's Harris School. Luis serves as a member of Chicago Booth's Global Leadership Group and the Advisory Council of the Rosenstone Center for Social Sector Innovation. He is also a trustee of the University of Chicago's Trust in India. I've known and worked with Luis for more than 10 years and feel so fortunate to be able to call him a friend. In this, I know I'm not alone. Luis is a trusted friend and mentor to so many of us in the University of Chicago community. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome and turn the program over to Luis.
Thank you, David. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Hansen to you. Professor Hansen is the Charles L. Hutchinson Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Political Science and the College at the University of Chicago. He was the Dean of the Social Services Division for 10 years and also chaired the Department of Political Science. I first met Mark 8 years ago in Mumbai when I was told he's coming down to India and he's an expert on talking about and analyzing presidential elections. So in Mumbai in 2012, he spoke on coming together or coming apart, America and the 2012 election. I think we could say the same thing about the current election also. He's written 3 books in the 90s, well, 2 of them in the 90s, one on Congress and the farm lobby. And the second is Mobilization, Participation, and Democracy in America. And it's interesting that, 27 years later, those topics are still so relevant today. His third book is what connected my son to him, when it's a book about cycling trips in Hyde Park and Kenwood. And my son sort of is looking forward to doing a cycling trip with Mark at some stage in the near future. Mark, thank you for joining us today. And normally people say the floor is yours, but this time I got to say the screen is yours.
Thank you, Luis. And good morning wherever you are, and welcome to this Harper Lecture. I'm really glad that everybody is with me. Let me now share my screen if I can find the right thing. Let's see, there it is. And let me make that, oops. Okay, let me try this again. Gonna get to full screen here somehow. There we go. So what I would like to do today is to step back a bit from the hubbub of the campaign and to talk about some of the larger forces that shape elections year in and year out here in the United States. There are several questions I'll want to consider along the way. The first is how it was possible that Donald Trump won the election in 2016. Secondly, how it's possible that Donald Trump may win the election in 2020. And third, and most importantly, what these larger forces portend for the future of American politics after Donald Trump, after 2020. So my main point today is going to be that Donald Trump did not defy gravity in winning the election in 2016, and that he's currently also not defying gravity. That is, there are these larger structural forces. I think that the 2016 campaign and what we've seen of his presidency indicates that he's been subject to those same forces as every other president in our recent political history. So what I want to begin is with the outcome in 2016. As you all know, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote over Donald Trump by about 3 million votes, or about 2.1 percentage points, but Donald Trump prevailed in the Electoral College. So on one level, the outcome of the 2016 election was an institutional fluke. This was the second time in 20 years that this has occurred, the fifth time in American history that it had occurred, that the winner failed to win the popular vote, but did prevail in the Electoral College. What I want to spring off to, though, is the following claim that if there is any election that should convince people that the campaigns really don't matter that much to the outcome of elections and that the candidates don't matter that much to the outcome of the election, 2016 should have been that election. So let me elaborate on that a little bit, and I'm going to do this fairly quickly because I just kind of wanted to use this to set this up. First point is that Donald Trump was probably the least experienced, the least qualified by experience of any presidential candidate or any president in the entire history of the United States. We've only had two presidents who have had no previous elective office or high military command. That was Taft and Hoover. But they both had extensive experience in government. Taft had been Secretary of State, and Hoover had been War Relief Administrator and Secretary of Commerce. We only have had two nominees previously for president who lacked legislative, executive, or military experience. And I'm cheating a little bit with Horace Greeley, who served 6 months in the House of Representatives. Alton Parker was the Chief Judge of the New York Court of Appeals, which is that state's high court. And then finally, we've only had one nominee in American history who had no government experience, no formal government experience at all, and that was Wendell Willkie, who ran against Franklin Roosevelt in 1940. Willkie was a utilities lawyer and a utility company executive, but he had extensive experience around public policy and around government. Donald Trump, of course, has never previously served in any public office, and in fact, he's never even been president of his condo board. So singularly lacking in experience relative to previous nominees. Likewise, Donald Trump was not particularly popular even within his own party. He lacked wide party support. Office holder endorsements here, as you can see, 11 House members, 1 senator, and 3 governors had endorsed him by the time he had wrapped up the nomination in June of 2016. Likewise, he lacked support in the press, even among Republican newspapers. So you can see in the middle column here that among those in 2012 who endorsed Romney in the 2012 election, 10 of those papers endorsed Clinton, 1 endorsed Trump. That was the Las Vegas paper. And 1 said either Gary Johnson or anybody other than Donald Trump. Likewise, the campaign was very strange in 2016 as well. Out of all of the spending that was done during the campaign, 2/3 of that spending, 65% of it, was done by Hillary Clinton. So Hillary Clinton outspent Donald Trump by a considerable margin. Likewise, Hillary Clinton out-advertised Donald Trump by a pretty wide margin. This only goes up to 4 weeks previously in the campaign, and there was a little bit of closing at the end, but it's still the case that Hillary Clinton outspent Donald Trump by about a 2-to-1 margin in television advertising in 2016. And finally, as everyone probably knows, Hillary Clinton was the most unpopular or the most unfavorably evaluated presidential candidate since we've been able to tell whether people are treated favorably or unfavorably. that is, except for Donald Trump. So what happened in 2016 was that, in fact, the electorate chose the candidate who spent less, chose the candidate who advertised less, chose the candidate who had the least experience, and chose the candidate who was viewed least favorably by the electorate. The only thing that Donald Trump actually won in 2016 was the battle for television coverage. This is something of a two-edged sword because a great deal of that coverage was, in fact, negative coverage. So I hope if you were to say, well, 2016 was determined by the quality of the campaign. That's oftentimes the story that we hear, is that the person who wages the best campaign is the person who wins. I hope I've persuaded you that perhaps that was not the case in 2016. And we oftentimes hear that it's really the better candidate who wins elections. And here too, I hope I've convinced you that there's at least some doubt as to whether by conventional measures, Donald Trump was the best candidate in 2016. So what I want to do now is I want to argue that despite how strange the candidates were in 2016, and despite how strange the campaigns were in 2016, shockingly, 2016 was a very ordinary US presidential election. And so in order to do this, I want to talk about what political analysts in political science call the fundamentals. There are 5 of them: the baseline partisanship of the electorate, that is, how many people consider themselves Republicans and consider themselves Democrats. Secondly, the condition of the economy. Third, the condition of foreign affairs, particularly whether we're at war or at peace. Third or fourth, the positioning of the candidates on the issues. And then finally, incumbency. Now, notice these are all what we might call structural factors. That is, they're largely outside of the control of the candidates and the campaigns. But these are the factors that year in and year out, over the long history of American politics, have set the terms of competition. And they play by far the largest role in determining the outcomes of election campaigns in the United States. So the fundamentals in 2016, I'm going to argue, meant that we would have a very close election in 2016, and of course we did. And the fundamentals also meant that it was close enough in order that a candidate could possibly win by putting together a bunch of states, winning narrowly in several states, and winning in the Electoral College, as in fact Donald Trump did. So let me begin with incumbency. Incumbency is an enormous advantage in all elections in the United States, and that's true for president as well. There was no incumbent running in 2016, and that was good for Donald Trump. As the party that is out of power, that is not the incumbent party, Donald Trump was actually advantaged by there not being an incumbent. If he had been running against an incumbent, it would have been a harder way to get to the presidency than he in fact faced. So as we can see here, if there is an incumbent running, the incumbent wins about 74% of the time. And if there is not an incumbent running, the candidate of the incumbent party, that is the candidate of the same party as the president, wins either 50% of the time in terms of the popular vote or 70% of the time in terms of the electoral vote. Second factor, perceptions of ideological proximity. Here again, this is a pretty ordinary campaign in 2016. That's that last point here on this graph. As you can see, there was a slightly larger proportion of the population that saw that Donald Trump was closer to where they stood on the issues than Hillary Clinton, but it wasn't a very big gap. And this was, again, something that was pretty good for Donald Trump. Part of the reason for this was, as I indicated before, Donald Trump had no previous experience. So he had no record. That is, it was very difficult to tell where he stood on issues. He made very few specifics in terms of policy proposals, lots of vague proposals about making America great again. And so the perceptions of where Donald Trump was ideologically were all over the map. And this was important and this was helpful for Donald Trump because people could see in Donald Trump what they wanted to see in Donald Trump. Third factor, the economy and the presidential vote. This is a scatter plot that shows the relationship between the change in real disposable income per capita on the horizontal axis and the incumbent party percentage of the two-party vote in presidential elections since 1948. As you can see, there's a very strong relationship between those two. The candidates who run in good economic times, those candidates of the incumbent party do better in elections that are in good economic times, and they do worse in bad economic times. As you can see, toward the left-hand side of this graph is 2016. And as you can see, in 2016, the growth in real disposable income per capita was about 1%. So it's a fairly weak economy by historical standards, as you can just tell by the scatter of points. And in fact, Hillary Clinton slightly overperformed what you would expect the Democratic candidate in 2016 to have gotten in terms of the percentage of the vote. But again, the weak economy, and this was very important, the weak economy was something that helped Donald Trump. Baseline partisanship of the electorate, a very closely divided electorate. And this was important as well because it meant that the two candidates sort of started out with fairly even numbers of supporters based on the natural partisanship of their supporters. And so the final point is that this was a very, very normal kind of presidential election, not just because the economy was a drag on Hillary Clinton, but also because in the end, the Democrats voted for Hillary Clinton and the Republicans voted for Donald Trump, and about in the numbers that they usually do. So you may remember in 2016 that there was a lot of gyration in the polls. Trump was up, Trump was down, Hillary Clinton was ahead by a lot, Hillary Clinton was ahead by a little bit. And my interpretation of that was that it was really Republicans trying to find a reason to support their nominee. Or alternatively, Republicans trying to find a reason to vote against the Democratic nominee. Now, I know that a lot of you will be interested in saying, well, what do these fundamentals have to do about this year? What should I be expecting for the election campaign this fall in 2020? And here the bottom line is that the fundamentals, some of them are in Trump's favor, but some of them are working against Donald Trump, and in one case very strongly against Donald Trump in 2020. So just to begin, the first thing which we should talk about is incumbency. So this is the #1 asset that President Trump has in running for re-election in 2020, is that he is the incumbent president. This year, it will presumably make as big a difference as it has in the past. In fact, you can argue that the last two presidents to be re-elected, Barack Obama in 2012 and George W. Bush in 2004, would not have been re-elected except for the power of incumbency. The empirical estimates we have about the value of incumbency is that it's worth somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 percentage points in terms of the popular vote, which in elections as close as we've been having over the last 25 years is a really, really big impact of incumbency. So that's the #1 asset that Donald Trump has heading into this election campaign. Secondly, the baseline partisanship of the electorate, it's about the same as it was in 2016. It's actually a little bit worse, as I'll discuss in a moment, for Donald Trump, but it's probably not going to be a factor that's vastly different in 2020 than it was in 2016. What about the positioning of the candidates on the issues? Well, one important difference in 2020 versus 2016 is that Donald Trump now has a record. He now has a record in government. And it's a record that shows that, in fact, Donald Trump has governed, at least, as a pretty hard-right president, a pretty conservative president on issues like abortion, on issues like race and immigration, on issues like the repeal of Obamacare, and on issues like taxes. He's a very conservative Republican. And so it's going to be less possible for people to imagine that Donald Trump has the positions that they would like Donald Trump to have than it was in 2016. And then finally, the big thing that's working against Donald Trump in 2020 is the economy. This is a factor that's gone from being a modest plus for President Trump to a major negative for President Trump. So before COVID hit, in January of 2020, the International Monetary Fund was predicting growth for the US economy in 2020 to be about 2%. The Congressional Budget Office was predicting 2.2%. After COVID hit, that changed enormously, as everybody knows. After the Congressional Budget Office, its latest projections for economic growth in the United States for the year 2020 are 6.1%. The International Monetary Fund, is minus 6.1%. The International Monetary Fund is forecasting minus 5.9% growth. And private estimates from private forecasters range from minus 4.6% to minus 9.5%. And as you can see on this chart, this is an economy that is literally off the charts. We have never observed an economy with the extent of negative growth that we will have this year. One thing to notice is that in the two cases that we've observed before, where there has been negative growth in a presidential election year, in 1980, when Jimmy Carter ran against Ronald Reagan, and in 2008, when Barack Obama ran against John McCain, both of those incumbent candidates, Jimmy Carter and John McCain, lost. So this is a really, really serious problem for Donald Trump. There's been a lot of attention lately to the way in which Donald Trump's standing in the polls has declined over the course of COVID. A lot of that has been attributed to beliefs about the president's handling of COVID. My view is that it has much more to do actually with the economic effects of COVID. That what we've been seeing is that people are anxious, that people have been affected in a negative way by the economy, and as they have in previous elections, they're taking it out on the incumbent president and on the party of the president. This would be a big problem for any president. It's not specific to Donald Trump. This is a big problem no matter who the president is. And this is a big negative for Donald Trump going into the fall campaign. Finally, there was already something of a headwind for Trump because Trump, it turns out, as many of you have surely heard, is the least favorably evaluated president in the history of public opinion polling in the United States. So since 1948. So here's a scatter plot that shows the relationship between the president's job approval. Do you approve or disapprove of the job that the president is doing as president? In the nearest Gallup poll to the presidential election, and the incumbent party percentage of the two-party vote. As you can see, for presidents who've been below 50% approval at the time of the election, every single one of them or their the candidate of their own party has lost the fall election. The one exception to that is in 1948. As you can see, that's the blue dot that's on the left-hand side of that graph. That was Harry Truman. And the reason why this is an exception is because Gallup believed that Harry Truman was such a goner that they stopped asking the question in July. And so while every other data point is from late October or early November, this is a data point from July. And in fact, Truman's standing improved through the fall campaign. So this is, as this indicates, presidential elections in the United States are very much a referendum on the president. And this is a president who has been singularly unpopular among the electorate from the very beginning of his term. We have never had a president in our history that has not spent a day over 50% approval. And we have never had a president in our history who, except for the very first week or two of his administration, had more of the electorate disapproving of his job performance than approving. And so for 2020, Donald Trump needs to draw to the inside of a straight. That's a poker term. A straight is 5 cards all in a row. Donald Trump holds a 2, a 3, a 4, and a 6, and he needs to draw a 5 to win the popular vote, at least in the election this fall. So I'm now going to turn to the future. And in order to do that, I want to take a closer look, as I indicated, at the fundamental, which is partisan identification. I think even though Donald Trump is facing some serious challenges to being reelected, it's unlikely that his support is going to collapse entirely. It's hard to believe that he's actually going to be on that regression line if you extend it as far to the left as you need to extend it to take in -5% economic growth in 2020. And the reason for that will be partisan identification. So I'm going to show you that partisanship is a very important factor in the choices that voters make. And I'm going to show you that partisanship has changed in such a way that it has become stronger as an influence on the vote than it has been in the past. So to start out, let's take a look at what partisan identification is. This in many ways is the greatest gift that political science has made to political commentary and political analysis, is this concept of partisan identification. So this is the survey question that is asked by the American National Election Studies, and it originated, in fact, the concept of partisan identification originated in a study that was done at the University of Michigan in 1952. And this is a question, notice, that asks, do you usually think of yourself as a Republican or Democrat? Would you call yourself a strong Republican or not a strong Republican, or not a strong Democrat or a strong Democrat? Do you think of yourself as closer to? Notice the language there. Think of yourself, call yourself. The concept of partisan identification is the notion that it is an identity. It is an identification. And it turns out that people have such identifications. In fact, there's only a small percentage of the population that will not claim either to be a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent. And there's actually a fairly small percentage that really is truly independent in their identifications. So this is partisan identification from 1952 to 2016. As you can see, what's changed over this long period of time is that where the Democrats used to have a big advantage in partisan identification in the electorate, that advantage has shrunken to where the two parties are about even in the support that they enjoy in the electorate. This has had important impact on the political geography of the United States. So just the other day, I saw Georgia described as a traditionally Republican state. But of course, if you look at the longer history of Georgia, Georgia was traditionally a Democratic state. And in fact, Georgia voted Democratic for president in every presidential election from 1868 until 1960. Texas, now thought of as a traditionally Republican state, voted for the Democratic nominee for president from 1872 to 1968. Oftentimes one will also see Vermont described as a traditionally Republican state, or excuse me, a traditionally Democratic state. But in the longer durée, in the longer scheme of things, Vermont was traditionally a Republican state. And in fact, Vermont voted continuously for Republican candidates for governor from 1856, which was the first year that the Republicans fielded a candidate in Vermont, until 1962. And that was every 2 years. Those are biennial elections. And so we've gone from our political geography looking like this to our political geography looking like this. Looking more carefully at the regional distribution of partisan identification, outside of the South, the balance between Republicans and Democrats has really not changed very much, except for a brief period in the 1980s, which was the influence of the Reagan presidency and then the George Herbert Walker Bush presidency. The Democrats have enjoyed a slight advantage in partisan identification in the North, the Midwest, and the West. Where the real changes have occurred has been in the South. So if you know the long history of the United States, the South was considered the solid South, and that meant the solid Democratic South up until about the 1960s. And this shows dramatically what has happened. So since the early 1950s, there's been a steady decline in partisan identification with the Democratic Party in the South and a steady increase in identification with the Republican Party in the South. A big part of that, of course, has been civil rights, the embrace by the Democratic Party of civil rights, but also the embrace by the Democratic Party of a kind of urban liberalism associated with Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy and figures of that type. So how has this change occurred? Well, there are two models of how partisan change occurs in the electorate. One is called conversion, and conversion is what it says. It's basically that people who used to think of themselves as Democrats now think of themselves as Republicans, or people who used to think of themselves as Republicans now think of themselves as Democrats. There's an alternative way that the electorate can change, and that's by noticing that every year the electorate is slightly different. And over a long time, say looking at 2020 compared to 1960, the electorate changes a lot. And it changes not necessarily because people are changing their own views, but because the people are changing. The older people are leaving the electorate, usually involuntarily, and older people are entering the electorate. And so that second explanation is called mobilization. So these are members of the electorate being replaced by new members who have a different partisan identification. So I don't have time to go into the evidence, but in looking at these two processes, both of them are at work. There is some evidence for conversion and some evidence for mobilization, but the overall conclusion is that the main influence on the change in the balance between the two parties in the electorate is mobilization. It's cohort replacement. It's younger voters with different partisan identifications becoming part of the electorate, and older voters leaving the electorate. Finally, the last thing that I want to note is that as that generational replacement has occurred, there has been a closer correspondence between ideology or policy views and one's partisanship. So as you can see, in 1972 and 1976, the Republicans overall in the electorate were more conservative than the Democrats were, but both parties were predominantly moderate parties in terms of where the electorate stood on issues. And on the right-hand side, in 2004 to 2008, we now have a Democratic Party that is predominantly a liberal party, and we have a Republican Party that is decisively a conservative party. So I'm going to skip ahead now and talk then about the parties and America's future. So I'm going to basically do some speculating about the way in which we might anticipate the baseline partisanship of the electorate shifting over the next several decades. I'm going to skip, and I can come back to it in the questions and answers. I'm going to skip what I had here on education and gender, only to say that that's the famous white working class that many people have attributed Trump's victory to. And I can come back to that again in the questions and answers. What I want to focus on in particular are two different things. One is the change in the ethnic and racial composition of the American electorate, and the way that that's likely to change the partisan balancing electorate. And then finally, the cohort change, the replacement of older voters or voters who are currently older with voters who are currently younger. So let me skip ahead. This is from exit polls. The Latinx vote for president, this is the Hispanic vote for president of the United States from 1972, when the exit polls began, until 2016. And as you can see, the Democrats have long enjoyed roughly a 3-2 advantage in the partisan vote for president. So about 3 Democratic votes for every 2 Republican votes among Latinos. The same is true in partisan identification, and this is something of a busy graph, but take a look at the dashed lines. Those are Latinos. The blue dashed line is Latino Democratic identifiers in the electorate, and the reddish or pinkish dashed line, or rose-colored dashed line, is Republican identifiers among Latinos. As you can see, it's basically the same story. In fact, it may be even a bit larger, about a 2-to-1 advantage in partisan identification among Latinos, 2-to-1 advantage for the Republicans over the Democrats. Why does this make a difference? Well, we've already seen that the Hispanic proportion of the electorate has tripled since 1980. And the projections are that by 2050, so 30 years from now, Latinos will constitute 25% of the electorate. And so we have a situation here where you can just do the math. We have a rising share of Latinos in the American electorate, and those Latinos are disproportionately Democratic in their preferences relative to the falling share of white voters here in the United States. And if anything, Donald Trump's presidency has actually accelerated the movement of Latinos, or cemented the movement of Latinos to the Republicans. The second big change that's going to be coming is a change in the age cohorts. So that is the actual composition of the electorate. So as older voters like myself depart the electorate, younger voters are going to come in, and those younger voters likewise have more Democratic affiliations relative to their elders. So here's the long story of partisanship by birth cohort. So the horizontal axis here are people who were born in 10-year or decade-long segments. And this is their partisan identification of that cohort. As you can see, the peak Democratic cohort was the cohort that was born between 1911 and 1920. That was the cohort that was eligible first to vote in 1932, when Franklin Roosevelt, the most successful Democratic president of the 20th century, was elected. And the peak Republican cohort was the cohort that was born between 1961 and 1970. That was the cohort that was first eligible to vote in 1979. And so first voted for president in 1980, when Ronald Reagan, the most successful Republican president of the 20th century, was elected. Since that time, the cohorts have been moving back toward the Democratic Party. And in fact, this is the graph from the Pew polling organization, which has very, very large samples. And as you can see, the silent generation, who were 71 to 88 years old in 2016, are more Republican and less Democratic than the baby boomer generation that succeeded them, born between 52 and 70. And they're more Republican than the Generation X, that was ages 36 to 51 in 2016. And then finally, the newest cohort, the millennial cohort, ages 18 to 35 in 2016, much more Democratic, much less Republican than the previous cohorts. So how fast is this generational replacement going to be? Well, here's the age cohort distribution. So these are the share of the 2016 electorate that was eligible to vote in earlier elections. And as you can see, there's about 5 to 7% turnover in the election just from generational replacement in a 4-year election cycle. And so we're going to have a lot more millennials in the electorate and a lot fewer of the very oldest generation of voters. So let me give you then a quick conclusion. Donald Trump won the 2016 election because it was a close election. And it was a close election not because of Donald Trump and not because of Hillary Clinton, but because of the fundamentals. In 2020, Donald Trump has a pretty tough path to election. In fact, it's much more likely that he'll be able to repeat an electoral college victory than that he'll win the popular vote. I think it's virtually impossible that he could win the popular vote in 2020. And the reason for that isn't Donald Trump, and the reason for that is not Joe Biden. The reason for that is not COVID. The reason for that is the fundamentals, the economic effects of COVID and other factors. And then finally, I've suggested that in the future, there are challenges for the Democratic Party to win elections in the future, but things are looking really, really tough for the Republican Party in the future unless it makes a shift to try to appeal to this rising group of voters who are both more brown, more Latino, and more Democratic in their orientations than the cohorts that preceded them. There's a lot that I've left out. There are certainly other things going on. Big question about how COVID will actually affect the balloting this fall. Big questions about vote suppression and those sorts of things. I'd be happy to answer more of those questions in the questions and answer. And so I'll stop there and invite your questions. Back to you, Louis.
Thank you, Mark. And again, it's been a fascinating session. As I said, I first heard you in 2012 then in 2016 and 2020, and I presume you'll be there also for 2024. So now what we have is Andrea's been behind the scene looking at the various questions, and she's going to throw up a list of some of the top and what's done. I would like each of you guys to vote on these, which you'd like to ask, and then we will be able to take a call on which one we will discuss. So it's up to you to decide which questions we get to ask Mark. So please go ahead and start sort of your questions. And in the meantime, Mark, I'll sort of start off with a question which someone else has already asked, and just sort of while people are polling. How high in the agenda of Congress will it be to codify into law deep structural reforms to the US political system? For example, limitations to presidential power and good governance. For example, maybe you could start on that while we, just give me a second. Andre, do we have enough responses yet for you to be able to give us some indication? Okay, we have some of the questions. I'm just going to take a snapshot of that so I will remember what to look at. Okay, so Mark, why don't you go back to the question which I just asked, which is about the agenda of Congress to set to codify into law some structural reforms.
Well, as you know, institutional reforms are very, very difficult. A lot of it does depend upon what the outcome actually looks like. If Biden would win a big victory, that would be very helpful to the prospects for institutional reform than if it's a more narrow victory. Most importantly, if the Democrats should happen to take back the Senate, and Charlie Cook is now projecting that they have at least an even chance of taking back the Senate, then the prospects for significant reform would be much stronger than they are now with a Republican-controlled Senate. The most likely reforms, I think, are reforms that the institutions themselves can make within. You may have noticed that at John Lewis's funeral, President Obama argued that the Senate should simply get rid of the filibuster, not just on judicial nominees, which has now been the case for the last 4 years, but should get rid of the filibuster as well on legislation. So that would be an enormous change relative to the past. For things like the Electoral College and the like, that's a much higher bar because it would require a constitutional amendment. And a requirement in the constitutional amendment is that the states would actually approve as well. And it's very difficult to imagine a situation where a third of the states would decide that the Electoral College, or more than a third, or less than a third of the states would decide the Electoral College is more in their interest than having no Electoral College.
Thank you. The next question, assuming Trump loses in November, what is the likely course, relevance, and power of Trumpism post-Trump?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there are actually two pieces of that. So the relevance of Trumpism within the Republican Party and the relevance of Trumpism within our political culture. So start with the Republican Party. First point to make is even if Trump loses in November, he's not going to go away. And in fact, I think we're likely to see Trump as an ex-president being much more active immediately in criticizing his successor, much less respectful in criticizing his successor than previous presidents had been. And so he's going to be there stirring the pot even after he's out of office. Whether that happens in 2020 or in 2024, Donald Trump's going to continue to have his fingers in things. And he's already talked about setting up some kind of organization to help him to do that. But just his Twitter feed is going to keep him active in that. Whether he has a lot of sway in the party depends a lot on how big his loss is. If he's narrowly defeated in 2020, he'll have a lot more influence than if he is decisively rejected by the electorate in 2020. Beyond that, I would say that it probably depends upon how suburban voters go in 2020. In many ways, they're the swing. In 2018, there was a real turn of suburban constituencies away from the Republican Party and toward the Democratic Party. And if that continues or strengthens in 2020, the Republican Party is going to be faced with a situation where they simply can't win a national election. And so they're going to have to make adjustments, even if there are people who would want to continue to go the way that Donald Trump has gone. In terms of our political culture, that's another difficult question. My concern about Trump as president is that he's shown that there is no force behind what have been taken to be important norms and expectations of presidents in our political culture. So the norm that you treat your opponents respectfully, the norm that you don't threaten to prosecute your opponents, the norm that you don't interfere in the Justice Department, the administration of justice. All of those things have been violated by this president, and he's gotten away with every single one of them. And he's gotten away with them because he has core support in the Republican Party, and they're not going to abandon him. So for a long time, those norms have been enforced by the belief that you would pay a price, a political price for violating those norms. And I think we've just seen that in the current state of affairs, there is no political price for violating those norms, which makes it a lot easier for future presidents to violate those norms as well.
Mark, how can a private citizen help ensure the integrity of our presidential election, given Trump's potential to disrupt it through disinformation, interrupting mail service, or other means?
I guess I would make two points here. The first is that ultimately election administration is a state and local matter. So the most important thing that a citizen can do is to make sure that the state authorities, and particularly the local authorities, in most locales it's counties that administer elections, in a few states, townships. But the most important thing that citizens can do is to make sure that the officials who oversee the election administration are aware that they're being watched, and making sure that they're aware that there will continue to be scrutiny of the actions that they take in the fall campaign and in the administration of the election. And so putting pressure on governors, putting pressure on state legislators, and putting pressure on secretaries of state who oversee elections and on county registrars and county voting boards. I think that's probably the most effective thing that you can do.
I think another thing is also, and this is something which we've discussed across the world, is just get people to come in and vote. A lot of people believe that their vote will not make a difference. No, it can make a difference. It can make a huge difference. And you know, and Mark, especially when you looked at all the data that you presented in true UChicago style, it also shows, therefore, it can be a close battle, and one needs to get out there to vote for whichever party you want. The next question: how important is choice of running mate in election process? I know there's been a lot of anticipation as who the running mate for Biden will be. Will race and diversity have an impact in the 2020 elections?
Sure. So the empirical evidence we have about vice presidential running mates is that they help slightly in their home states and that they have no effect whatsoever outside of their home states. Donald Trump's vice president, of course, is Mike Pence, who's from Indiana. And he chose Pence even though Indiana is the state that was very likely to go Republican in any case. And most of the strong candidates whom Biden is considering for vice president come from states that are basically blue states. They're from California, or they're from Illinois, or from Massachusetts, or something like that. So I don't think we're likely to see that the vice presidential pick matters a whole lot. where you know, I do think that it's important symbolically that Biden has pledged to choose a woman as vice presidential candidate. And it seems that he is leaning toward a woman of color. I think part of that has to do with the hope of capitalizing on the energy of the Black Lives Matters protests. And there is quite a lot of energy, and there will continue to be quite a lot of energy there. That can be good for Democratic turnout, not just in states that are Democratic, but also in swing states like Michigan, and even in states like Georgia, where the current polls have Biden and Trump about even. So the African-American vote can make a tremendous amount of difference. The other piece of Biden, I think, probably leaning toward an African-American running mate, is that he owes and the party owe African-American voters big time, and especially Biden himself. He was dead in the water until Jim Clyburn endorsed him in South Carolina, and then he won South Carolina going away, and the whole nomination campaign was over. And that was all because of African-American voters and the influence that Jim Clyburn's views had on African-American voters in South Carolina. So I think there's a political debt as well that will incline Biden toward a woman of color, and particularly toward an African-American woman.
What about the age of the presidential candidate, and therefore the impact, therefore, on of the vice presidential person? Would that make a difference this time around?
Well, I mean, possibly it could. So, so in 1956, Eisenhower had a heart attack. And all of a sudden people thought, oh my gosh, if Eisenhower dies, then we have Nixon. And there was a brief flurry of activity about whether the Republicans, well, maybe we shouldn't have Nixon as the running mate because people might be concerned about Eisenhower's health and so forth. I mean, the same may be true here, but I would say in 56, that was a pretty short-lived problem. And I would anticipate that it's going to be a fairly minor, it's going to have a fairly minor impact on the election. Although it, you know, from the standpoint of both candidates, they would at least want to say that, you know, the likelihood that my vice presidential candidate could handle the job is pretty good. And I would say most of the people who are being considered by Biden would meet that criterion.
Okay. We have possibly, let's see how long we take, but this may be the last question. We may have time for one more. Can you tell more about the history of foreign interventions into US elections and what you expect for this year?
I don't think we know a lot. I do think that there have often been attempts to intervene in some way in American elections, especially around wartime. In the 1916 election, 1940 election. You know, in 2016, there seems to be a greater success. The internet has made a lot more things possible. You know, on the other hand, I think we're on to it. And while we may not be as guarded against it as we ought to have been, given what happened in 2016, I do think that we're in a position to be more aware of it and therefore to be in a position to combat it.
Okay. Oh, we have time for one more then. What is the likely impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the US presidential election campaign? You've talked about the economic impact, but what about things like, you know, being able to mail in, vote by mail, and other implications and social distancing, etc.?
I think that's the big question mark. We just don't know. I think we've seen from the primaries that, first of all, it had a significant effect on turnout in the primaries. But in areas where there was a great deal of passion, a great deal of interest in participating in the primaries, it didn't have such a huge effect. For instance, in Wisconsin, where people stood 6 feet apart for hours to get to vote. So I do think that it's an enormous question mark. We just don't have anything in our experience. On the other hand, I do think that there is a large fraction of the electorate on both sides, actually, both on the Democratic side and on the Republican side, that would be willing to run a risk in order to participate in this fall's election. The last thing I'd say about it is that one of the great ironies of the way that the president has handled the COVID crisis is in his eagerness to reopen states. He seems to have pushed the COVID peak further back in the year, which is a bad thing both in terms of the economic recovery and a bad thing in terms of his being able to campaign in the fall. So he may have done himself a disservice by kind of pushing off when COVID would have its biggest effects.
Okay. I think we've run out of time. Thank you, Mark, and I'm going to pass it on to David now. Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louis, and thank you, Professor Hansen, for an excellent presentation and for sharing your knowledge and insights with us. On behalf of the University of Chicago Alumni Office, thank you all for joining us. We know you have a lot of challenges and demands for your time and attention right now, and we greatly appreciate your interest in the university. The recording of this lecture will soon be posted on the Harper Lecture YouTube channel, where you can also view dozens of prior lectures. Today's program has now concluded, and you may now disconnect. Farewell.